Study Session 2: Educational Practice in Ancient Greece. Introduction. In this study session, we will look at how the Greeks developed the basic forms of arts and sciences, of literature, and of philosophy. History bears that they were the first to study systematically the closely related subjects of ethics, politics, and education, in brackets, more than 2,000 years ago. Although their schools were not public institutions aimed at public and civic purposes, they were still the first to use the idea of schooling as a means of preparing citizens for citizenship. For our purposes in this study session, only two states are of value: Sparta and Athens. These, in the first place, presented two distinct types of education: Sparta for military strength, and Athens for full development of the individual. In the second place, these were the roots of modern Western educational thought and practice: Sparta, the totalitarian, and Athens, the democratic. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to appraise the Spartan education with a reflection on the African traditional education, and highlight the educational practice in Athens. The ancient Greek world extended far beyond the boundaries of modern Greece. It covered most of the coastal regions of the Mediterranean and Black Seas, from Asia Minor to Marseilles, and from Egypt to the mouths of the Danube. The unit of the political organization of the Greeks was the city, not the nation, as in the modern world. Each city was politically independent of each other's government. Each city was also, to a very large extent, economically self-sufficient. Although the Greek cities were politically independent of each other, all Greeks shared a strong consciousness of their racial and cultural affinity with one another, and a profound belief in the superiority of Hellenic to other people. To the Greeks, other non-Greeks are Hellenes. The Spartan education. Among those who were to shape the destinies of Greece were the Spartans. Warring was their life, and conquest their occupation. Sparta had three groups of people. At the top were the invaders, who sought to maintain their uniqueness, dominating all others. They were the master class. These were the citizens with all civil rights and responsibilities. The next class below was dwellers around, free men living in surrounding towns and mountain villages. They were taxed by the master class, gave military service when called, and worked as merchants and traders in the culture. They had no part in governance and were prohibited from marrying into the master class. The third class in the social pattern was composed of slaves, the non-Dorian population, which the invaders conquered. They were the citizens of villages and cities overcome and reduced to slavery. Having no status in the culture, helots were subject to martial law. They remained constantly under surveillance of the secret police and might be taken and killed at any time without show of cause or trial. It has been estimated that between 640 to 631 BC, they were in Sparta and the surrounding areas comprised of 32,000 Spartan men, women, and children, who constituted the master class. The male citizens of this group were rulers of some 120,000 Piraci and 224,000 Helots. The Spartan citizens sat on a powder keg of discontent and unrest, and the only way they knew to handle the precarious situation was to make themselves a powerful standing army that is able at any moment to crush rebellion and keep the masses in their place. Sparta was an aristocratic military state devoted to maintaining the privileged status of the citizen. All in its situation, including education, were designed to serve this end. In Sparta, the child belonged to the state, and the state accepted its responsibility by providing a complete educational system for him, a system which it controlled absolutely. The aim of this education was to make the child into the image desired by the state. The state insisted that only the physically and emotionally fit marry and produce children. Then, when the child was born, it was presented to the ephors, or government administrators, who judged its fitness to live and be educated for citizenship. Those judged unfit were taken to a designated hillside to die or be rescued by Peraci or Helots and reared as they desired. The fit were returned to their mothers, who as state nurses reared them until the age of 7. The early education of the child was in the home and was the responsibility of the mother. This consisted in learning very early how to endure pain, be resourceful, and enjoy exercises designed to toughen and strengthen the body. At 7, the boy was placed in a boarding school. From this time on, his education was the sole responsibility of the Spartan community, supervised carefully by the padonomos. The aim of education at this stage of growth was to develop a feeling of equality, comradeship, and esprit de corps. Boys were forced to endure hardship. Their living and clothing were sent. They were taught to take care of themselves, to know the country and its demands, and to be resourceful at all times. They were whipped often, both as punishment and as test of endurance. Fighting was encouraged as a form of exercise and a method of hardening the body. The boys' training, in addition, included dancing, in bracket as military exercise, gymnastics, etc. Neither reading nor writing was taught, though some of them learned these arts privately. The Spartans disliked oratory, feeling that it was a sign of intemperance. Some attention was given to poetry, war song, etc. Insofar as they portrayed bravery and loyalty to the state, memory was stressed as the best method of learning. When the boy reached 18, he was deemed ready for strenuous military training, to which he would devote himself for the next 12 years. Bands of young men were sent out on maneuvers. Often, they ambushed helots as practice for warfare. At 20, the youth took the oath of allegiance to the state. At 30, they became a citizen. If he had proved himself worthy in all the tests and performances, he was then obligated to sit in the public assembly barracks and serve as teacher of the boys. At the age of 30, The Spartan was compelled to marry for the good of the state. He was supposed to pick a wife adequately prepared physically and psychologically to bear him children, who would be efficient and effective soldiers or mothers of soldiers. Although he maintained a home for his wife and children, he spent most of his time in the public barracks as a member of the standing army, fighting for the state or supervising the education of the boys. When the citizen reached 45, he will be relieved of strenuous campaigning and assigned to the Home Guard. His duties were confined to local military activities and the education of the youth. At 60, an age which very few reached, since the average age of males at that time was 25, he became an elder statesman, eligible to serve in the council and obligated to give wise advice to leaders of the state and to youths. Appraisal of the Spartan education policy. The Spartan education policy, as we have highlighted above, could be regarded as a mixture of the good and the bad. The first argument in favor of the Spartan education was the efficiency in its organization. As we have already observed, education in Sparta was centralized and state-controlled. In many developing countries of the world today, including Nigeria, education is regarded as a governmental enterprise and is therefore organized and controlled by the state. The efficiency of the Spartan education was as a result of the state control on education. Secondly, Spartan education had a focus, a philosophy that was made known to the Spartans. The philosophy of the Spartan education, though quite narrow, was clear. Many developing countries of the world today are still battling with the problem of relevance in education. The Spartan educational system of the classical era was relevant to the needs and aspirations of the people of the time. It was an education that aimed at producing patriotic, obedient, and military efficient citizens. All male children were brought up for the state, trained together in the barracks. The programs of the Spartan education were tailored towards whatever might contribute to their military efficiency, as well as a high sense of comradeship. The provision of equal education for men and women in Sparta was in the right direction. As discussed, women in Sparta received state education that prepared them for womanhood, whilst men were trained by the state to defend her integrity. However, one could argue that the Spartan educational policy was too narrow, being tied strictly to defense of the state. Other areas of need, particularly economic and socio-cultural aspects of life, were neglected. An educational policy that aims solely at preparing men for war and not for peace is inadequate and short-sighted. Apart from these, Spartan education failed to take care of the individual differences in human beings. An educational policy that had no regard for human dignity as well as human rights could not be regarded as ideal. The Athenian education. Athens, unlike Sparta, was a democratic city. Every citizen had the right to vote or to be voted for into elective offices. All Athenians participated in the discussion of matters affecting the city-state, and they all took a democratic decision at the General Assembly. The population in Athens which was a few thousands, was small enough to allow everybody to gather in the Athena Agora, that is, the People's Assembly, to initiate, discuss, or pass legislations. This democratic constitution of Athens, in no small way, laid the foundation of the Western public education. Unlike Sparta, Athens had no publicly organized education for girls. Education for girls, which was mainly moral and domestic training, was given at home by their mothers. Girls in Athens did not attend schools, and women rarely appeared in public except at religious ceremonies. Schooling began for the boys at the age of 7. 3 types of schools were available for the Athenian boys. These are: 1. The letter school for reading and writing. 2. The music school for lyric, poetry, and lyre. In brackets, music included not only the art, but also the learning by heart and recitation of poetry. The poems of Homer form the principal basis of this musical education, and these poems serve to mold the moral character and sentiments of the pupils. 3. Gymnastic school or palestra. The Athenian boys usually attended the letters and music schools in the morning and the gymnastic school in the afternoon. The rich Athenian had a manservant called a pedagogue to escort the boys to and from school. He was to keep them from loitering about and to punish them if they disobeyed simple orders. Teaching at that time was a much more difficult task than it is in modern times. Often, the teacher had the only manuscript and dictated daily portions to be written by the pupils on a tablet for memorization. The goal of the Athenian education was to produce an all-round cultured man who would be physically, mentally, and spiritually fit. To achieve these objectives, the curriculum of the Athenian schools consisted of reading, writing, music, poetry, mathematics, and gymnastics. The schools did not teach religion because religion was deeply embedded in literature as well as the political life of the people. Boys' schooling continued until the age of 18. Between the age of 18 and 20 years, the Athenian boy was engaged in the national military service, organized in the interest of the state. Thereafter, he was free to choose a career for himself. The Athenian boy usually had his eyes on politics after the national military service. There were no organized secondary institutions in Athens of the classical era as we have in the modern times. In fact, the state had a carefree attitude to education and therefore maintained a loose control over the administration of schools. The implication of this laissez-faire attitude of the government towards education was that there were no defined guidelines on the establishment as well as on what went on in the school system. This freedom, coupled with the peaceful atmosphere, which was brought about by the democratic political principles, as well as the flourishing commercial activities, made it possible for foreign teachers to settle in Athens. The foreign teachers had the support of the Athenian aristocrats, who served as their audience and their patrons. The foreign professional teachers, who were referred to as the sophists, charged fees for preparing the young Athenian for public life. The word sophistry at first meant wise man, but it soon came to have a derogatory meaning, as in sophistry in bracket sophos is Greek word for wise. The sophists, indeed, influenced the thoughts of the Athenian youths at the time, and they laid the foundation of higher education in Athens. Notable among the sophists were Protagoras of Abdera, Hippias of Elis, Gorgias of Sicily, and Zeno of Elea. The sophists made valuable contributions to the development of three disciples. In the first place, they improved on the teaching of grammar in the Athenian schools. The sophists taught such grammatical items such as genders, tenses, and moods, and thus founded the study of grammar as a science in Athens. Secondly, the sophists developed the study of prose, and this gave rise to the invention of rhetoric as a science or art of public speaking. Oratory became very useful in the Athenian courts, as well as in the political assemblies. The third aspect of knowledge developed by the sophists was logic. The three disciplines, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, assisted in promoting and perfecting other new disciplines, including medicine, political theory, and geography in the year to come. Tip: specifically, the sophists were teachers of youths and investigators seeking accurate knowledge. They were comparable to modern research professors. They realized that the need in Periclean Athens for effective speech demanded precision of thoughts, and that thinking could never be accurate without a clear understanding of language. As a result of their investigations, the sophists reached conclusions which fascinated the youth of Athens on the one hand, and angered beyond measure the old men who still clung to past and its gods on the other hand. The sophists, searching for knowledge and impelled by the forces of the world in which they lived, saw the senses as the only avenues of fact, and thus the measures of all truths. In short, the sophists were iconoclastic. They were subversive of authorities and traditions. Contributions of notable sophists: Protagoras, in brackets, circa 481 to 411 BC, came to Athens from Thrace at the invitation of Pericles, 455 BC. He proposed to make the boys of Athens, through teaching, good citizens, successful in private affairs, and efficient in public service. His writings included treatises on education, on grammar, on correct speech, which he wrote as a textbook for his pupils. Prodicus, born 465 or 450, and died around 399 BC. He promised to teach his pupils virtue and good character. Among the subjects he was prepared to teach were ethics, natural philosophy, history of religion, and language. He strove to develop in his pupils a sense of the accuracy of words and their use. His book on correct language stressed the use of the right word to convey the correct shade of meaning. Hippias, 5th century BC, was born in Elis and came to Athens boasting that he was able to teach everything. From the pictures others have drawn of him, he was a master exhibitionist and egoistic. his skill laid in his ability to popularize knowledge, even if on a superficial level. He wrote on many subjects and did not hesitate to discuss at length on anything. Gorgias, circa 483 to 375 BC. Gorgias of Leontini was a specialist in rhetoric, while others proposed to make their pupils good individuals and good citizens. Gorgias laid claim to one ability: to make his pupils skillful orators and users of words. He came to Athens in 427 BC and astonished the citizens by using prose instead of poetry. However, his prose was often more beautiful than any poetry they had heard. Appraisal of the Athenian education. Athens of the classical era had an educational policy that was broad-based and culturally oriented. It was an education aimed at producing an all-round person. Though there were no secondary education of the modern time at the period, yet the Athenian boy were expected to remain at school until the age of 18 years. Between the age of 18 and 20, they served state in the national military service. The idea of children staying at school until the mature age of 18 was welcomed. In the modern world, many countries have recognized the importance of compulsory education for the youth. The policy of national military service being made compulsory for the Athenian boys had been copied by many developing as well as developed countries today. The educational policy in Athens favored the importation of foreign cultures. The sophists, for example, settled in Athens to sell their skills for money. The educational policy in Athens of the classical era, on the other hand, had some inadequacies. Education was reserved for the Athenian boys. Girls were not given public education. A system of education that favors male alone without their female counterparts cannot be regarded as adequate in the modern world. Apart from this, the Athenian education was mainly on how to succeed in the political affairs of the city-state. The curriculum consisted of reading, writing, mathematics, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and gymnastics. Vocational education was regarded as inferior. In the modern times, vocational as well as educational technology is taken more seriously. Lastly, the organization and control of the Athenian education were faulty. As we observed earlier in this chapter, the state maintained a carefree attitude towards the administration and control of the schools. In the modern world, the state ought to show interest in the organization and control of the educational system, though this should not be excessive. Study session summary. In this study session, we learned that Sparta had three groups of people, namely the Spartan citizens, the Peresi, and the Helots. Only the citizens were given education. The child belonged to the state, and the state educated him. The Spartan education provided education for men and women. However, it was an education tied to the defense of the state. It was therefore inadequate for a national development. We also learned and examined the type of education available in Athens. Unlike Sparta, Athens had no publicly organized education for girls. There were three types of school in Athens, namely the letters school, the music school, and the gymnastics school. There was no organized secondary institution as we have in the modern times. The sophists, however, organized lessons for the children of notable people, where grammar, rhetoric, and logic were taught. Education in Athens was broad-based and culturally oriented. End of study session 2. Thank you for listening.